Welcome to another Liquid Bullet production. With us today is Mr. Alan Jackaman. Thanks for coming, Alan.
Thank you, Lee.
So today we're going to talk about Robert Napper. Before we go into that, can we just get a little bit of your background, please, Alan?
My background is that I'm a retired police officer now, but I, after leaving the services in 1976, I joined the police and quickly moved into the criminal investigation department, and from there into investigating homicide, where I spent most of my career. And I was at the inception of the AMIP, which is the major incident team which investigates murder throughout London, which was developed in 1994. I was on one of the first teams for that, and investigated many murders, mostly in South London, but in other areas as well, until I left the police in 2002 and joined the Murder Review Group as a civilian. I was employed by the Home Office to investigate cold case murders, which I did that for another 13 years, investigated probably hundreds of murders in that time, and eventually retired in 2016.
Yeah. So some of the cases you worked on are quite high profile, aren't they? Quite well known.
Well, name dropping, I suppose. Colin Ireland, the serial homosexual killer. Van Hoogstraten, people may remember, was the rent landlord, famous rogue landlord from Brighton. Trying to think of other ones, but Rachel Nickell is probably the most notorious one. Although I wasn't involved in that investigation, I was led to it from the investigation that I carried out in South East London into the murders of Samantha and Jazmine Bisset in their flat in Heathfield Terrace, Plumstead, on the 3rd of November 1993.
Can you just tell us a little bit about them sort of murders?
The type of murders, well, the type of murders that I would be asked to investigate would be the whole range, from gangland killings through to domestic killings. There was we have tried it now, which is black on black killings, but there were really no terrorist branch, of course, is another branch of of murder, but mostly the murders that we investigate cover the whole gamut of what you could possibly envisage as the taking of someone's life.
So how was the scene in relation? It wasn't just another job.
The Bisset case, from the off, I was called there on the next day, the 4th of November. It was a dark and it was a very overcast, dismal day. The flat overlooked Winds Common, which is an open, windswept area anyway. But going into the flat, it had been reported to me, and I was sent down there being told that it was a domestic murder. Straight away, walking into the front door, it took very little, a brief moment to understand, to realise that this was something really far out of the ordinary, and it wasn't a domestic murder. We were informed straight away that the boyfriend of the victim, Samantha Bisset, had been arrested and was in the police station at Plumstead. He was arrested at the scene. He had turned up, and it was him who had called the police initially. He'd been he'd been working a night shift and had come home to find the mortise lock on the front door, which would never happened. Samantha was quite laid back about security, so he shouted through the letterbox, and he eventually found a key for the mortise lock and was able to get in and found Samantha in the living room. She had been eviscerated, probably is the only way to describe it. A terrible, terrible sight for him. And then, of course, he staggered back, wondered what had happened to the little girl, Jazmine, who wasn't his daughter, but he had been a part of her upbringing, and found her dead in her cot. She'd been smothered. So police were called, and the first officers on scene, the first CID officer on scene, was confronted by this Conrad Ellen was his name, Cozy, and his hands were covered in red. So he was arrested immediately. It transpired that he worked in a dye factory, and the red was from the dyes that he'd been working with overnight. So he was quickly interviewed and released, and although nobody is ever written off as a suspect, nobody gave any credibility really to him possibly being
I suppose it was pretty
responsible
sort of maybe CCTV footage at work, or clocking in and out.
This is back in '93. CCTV wasn't used very much at all in those days, but he was alibied out, and he was just such a nice guy, and he had no previous convictions, and he was in total shock, and it was obvious that he obviously had his only input into the killing was that he had found them in the morning when he came.
Can I just jump back? You said about the when you went to go into the house, the mortise lock was on. So
yes.
Was this obviously the killer had put that on when you went in the house, or
no? What had happened? We thought, because there was a massive. It's a small, if you can imagine, an end of terrace flat. Front door. There was a balcony door at the side which led out to a grass area, a small balcony. The door led straight into a hallway. On the right was a kitchen, on the left, bedroom and bathroom, and then all the way through there was a living room. That was about it. It was a very small flat. When you went into the front door, there was a massive pooling of blood by the front door. So everybody assumed that Samantha had disturbed someone or let someone in the front door, and then been killed there and dragged into the living room where these atrocities were performed on her body. But it later transpired, we found by means of deduction that he never ever went in by the front door. He probably turned the mortise lock on from the inside after he'd killed her, but he actually got in through the balcony window, French window, which was insecure and quite easy to climb in. I'll come on to how we found evidence of him doing that a bit later. But the first thing that tipped us off was that witnesses had said that the blind was always in the up position. No one had ever seen it down, and her boyfriend said that was broken and it was in the up position. When we examined it, the string holding it up had been cut with a knife and it was down. Oh, right. So he'd obviously dropped that to carry on with whatever he was doing in the living room. And he had, as I say, moving on, jumping a bit, he'd got in through that balcony, found it insecure, disturbed her in the hallway, killed her by stabbing her several times, dragged her into the living room. The order of events as to when he killed the little girl, we'll never know. But at some stage he went into her room and not only smothered her, but sexually assaulted her as well.
Really?
And she was a 4-year-old girl. So it was quite a scene. And not, as I'd been informed originally, a domestic. So we were confronted with this scene, no suspects. Obviously we started off doing all the background into her, and that wasn't made easy because she had had a background of moving in hippie circles in those days, and so she travelled all around the south coast of England and Wales. She had relatives in Scotland, so she'd moved around a lot, and whilst she was doing this she had become a drug addict.
Right.
This quite dependent on drugs, hard drugs. Then she fell pregnant with Jazmine, and I mean, she's just such a wonderful mother because she decided she had a life choice there. So she gave up all of this hippie stuff that she'd been involved in. She came off drugs, she got herself this little flat and got Jazmine into nursery school and devoted her entire life to Jazmine. And that was where she was living at the time. Her only relatives, she had her father had died when she was about 14. She had a mother who had married again and was living in Scotland. They were quite close, but obviously living in Scotland, they didn't see each other that often. But they did. She stayed up there, and they'd been to visit her in Plumstead. Stepfather was quite comfortably off. He was a builder up in near Aberdeen, and supported her up to a point. But she was so proud, it was difficult to give her any money. But so she had this little insular life. On her last day, she'd picked up Jazmine from nursery school, got the taxi home, which she always did. She would walk there and then get the taxi home with Jazmine to save a couple of pounds. The taxi driver dropped her off at about 3 o'clock, I think, and she settled down for the evening. And the taxi driver, as far as we know, was the last person to see her alive.
So how do you think that sort of is it a break-in that Robert Napper done? Actually a broken window?
No, it was insecure.
Insecure.
Yeah, it was insecure. So we then, the progress of the inquiry is, of course, you have to start eliminating every possibility. So we, part of the forensics is to fingerprint a place like this. And the week before, Jazmine had a party with all her little friends around. So hundreds of child's fingerprints everywhere. But in that flat, we managed, which I've never known in any other investigation that I've done, we eliminated every fingerprint.
Blimey.
All the kids, everybody. And we thought, well, he must have worn gloves.
So there was no sort of evidence found?
No forensics. There was no evidence of any semen on the body. We don't know if he sexually assaulted her. There was the one thing that we did have in the way of evidence in bits and pieces around the flat, odd bits of an Adidas size 9 training shoe in blood. So we took all the lifts that we possibly could of this parts of training shoe, and then we put a composite together. So we knew that the killer was wearing a size 9 Adidas training shoe at the time of the killing. I mean, 2 months after the murder, I went back to the flat and we redid it again forensically from top to bottom to see if we could find any sort of clues, because we were struggling by that time. And in the Daily Mirror, which was still, because the flat had been left, just locked up and left, boarded up and left, in a Daily Mirror I opened it up and it was dated the day of the murder, 3rd of November, and in the centre pages there was a footprint of an Adidas training shoe that fitted in with the others, so it gave us almost a complete shoe print.
Right. So that was from a previous murder, this one? That was...
No, this is from the same scene. The Adidas we...
Oh, in the paper was from the same scene?
In the same scene, but it had been missed on the first.
Sorry.
If you can... In a murder scene, sometimes it'll be in a footpath or where public have access, or where in a venue, in a restaurant, and people need to reopen it. If you've got a scene where you can shut it down, do what you've got to do, let things settle down,
and then disturb it.
Nothing disturb, and then go back with a fresh pair of eyes, it's amazing what you can find.
Yeah.
And that's what we did, and we turned up this Adidas footprint, which added to the one that we already had. So we did a lot of work on that, found out where it was made in Korea and how many were ever issued, and circulated it to all police stations. If they get any burglars in, look at the shoes to see if they match with this shoe print. Got nowhere. So we were going down the line then, and we started to look at her background, any friends she had, and this involved hundreds and hundreds of actions. But eventually, of course, we weren't having a result. So the powers that be started to cut down on the investigation, and we were down to just 5 of us in the end on this team, which wasn't a very big team in the beginning. It hadn't made any sort of impact in the press, so the job wasn't under pressure to get it solved. And meanwhile, on the other side of London, 6 months prior to this, of course, Rachel Nickell had been murdered in Wimbledon Common. So it was one of our lines of inquiry to go to the office at Wimbledon to see if it could possibly be linked.
So if you could find a match.
And they initially said, no, they already had a suspect. And we all know who that is, it's Mr. Stagg. So they were quite satisfied that they had their man, and he couldn't possibly have been the killer of Samantha because he was in custody on remand for the murder of Rachel Nickell when Samantha was murdered. So that was put to one side. Then, as the investigation started to lose a bit of speed, we had more and more pressure on us to shut it down. But the SIO, Superintendent Vicky Banks, he revisited and reread through all the statements and all the forensics. And that is another good thing to do for any budding detected out there on murders, you have to constantly read all of your actions and statements and messages, because when they come in, they may not be particularly relevant, but when you look at them in 2 months' time, they can become so.
Yeah.
And so you've got to constantly reread everything. And Mickey decided that he would resubmit the fingerprints to Fingerprint Branch, and he got a lot of resistance for that to be done. That had never been done before. Every fingerprint had been eliminated, but he insisted that he wanted it all run through again, and they did. And lo and behold, very sheepishly, about a week later, they come back to us in our incident room and produce these fingerprints, which come down to Robert Napper. One set at the balcony, one set on the door jamb to the child's bedroom, and another set on the cot. And they had originally been put down to Samantha Bisset, and they were so similar they could easily make a mistake. And a mistake was made. The biggest mistake made was that in those days you had a fingerprint sample as they came through. An expert would look at them, and then they would go to another expert who would double check. They hadn't double checked. The first guy had made that slight error, took them to be the victims, so they were never double checked. So all that time, that 6 months, we could have arrested him almost on.
So was Robert Napper already on the system as a known person?
He wasn't in our system at all.
Wasn't. Oh right.
He didn't have any sexual offences to his name. He had a couple for firearms, a couple for shoplifting, but no sexual offences at all. And he wasn't in Homes, which is the Home Office computer system, which we didn't actually use on this job, amazingly, but he wasn't in our, he'd never come to notice. No one had ever propped him up as a possible suspect or anything. So there we had it. Fingerprints came up. Robert Napper had done this. So then, looking back at the same time, prior to our murder, there was a series of rapes called the Green Chain Rapes, which was happened in quick succession on the Green Chain Walk in South East London, which anybody who lives in South East London will know it well. It it goes through parklands and woods, all the way from Lewisham all the way down to Thamesmead. It's a very long, beautiful country walk, basically. And along this walk, these rapes had been committed in quick succession in the early part of 1992. They had set up their own murder team to look at this, because they were becoming progressively more violent. The last offence was very violent. The young lady that was attacked received quite serious injuries. Shortly after that, Rachel Nickell was murdered at Wimbledon Common, and the rapes stopped stone dead. No more were committed. Now, on that rape inquiry, that was on Holmes. They did have that on the computer. They had a DNA sample as well from some of the rape victims. So they had a DNA sample, but they couldn't match it with anyone. So when Napper was arrested, there were a couple of the indexers on the team that had worked on the Green Chain Rape inquiry. And they took one look at his photograph that matched the photo fit for the rapist, the Green Chain Rapist. Exactly, it's like a double image almost. So we called in the team investigating the rapes. So we think we've got your rapist. They said, oh, no way, he's far too tall. It transpired that they had shut down the rape inquiry because they weren't getting any more rapes and they needed to free up people for other jobs. That's all fair enough. But the parameters around which they shut down the inquiry was that all of the victims said that the suspect was around between 5'7", 5'8" tall. Napper was 6'1". Right at the end of that inquiry, at around the time that Rachel Nickell was murdered, two separate people put up Napper as a possible suspect for as a green chain rapist. Detectives went round to his house, got him to come in to give a DNA sample. He didn't turn up. They went back and he moved, and they never followed it up because the inquiry was closed down. They took a look at his profile and he was 6'1", and they said he comes outside the parameters.
It's only like, it's not hardly anything.
I know.
Especially if you're only guessing that size. It's not
This is a sore point, which something that happened. It shouldn't have happened, but it did. And you look back and you think, well, that's crazy. But the guy had so much. He seemed to be riding his luck to an incredible degree. There was a thing with the fingerprints, and the thing with the DNA. I mean, he was about to be lifted so many times, but for one reason or another, it didn't happen. And the things with the fingerprints that were so close to being a match for Samantha Bisset. Not only that, they had the same date of birth, 25th of February 1967, and they'd never ever met. They had no contact with each other whatsoever. So they were born on the same day and he killed her. And moving down the line, when I arrested him 6 months later, that's my date of birth as well, 25th February. Not the same year, but it's a bit. Yeah. It's a bit a coincidence too far, but that is actually true. So Napper was moving on. So he, in the rape inquiry, just to tie things together, they employed a psychological profiler, Paul Britton, who's well known, quite famous because he was also the psychological profiler on Rachel Nickell. And then he became the psychological profiler on Samantha Bisset. He came down and he gave each one of those a separate profile, but he never ever, at the time, connected the three. Yeah. After we'd arrested Napper and got some firm evidence against him, we still didn't have any DNA, remember, for the murder. We had his fingerprints at the scene, and when I arrested him, one of the questions I asked him was, have you ever been to 1A Heathfield Terrace? And he replied, no, I've never been there, which I wrote down in my pocketbook, and he signed that as being correct when we got back to Bexley Heath. Well, that was good evidence, because what we didn't want him to say was that he had been there and he was the handyman, or he was Billy Burglar, and but he had nothing to do with the murder, just to validate his fingerprints being at the scene. So we did have fingerprints. We didn't have when we searched his place, we didn't find a shoe, any Adidas training shoes, but we did find a box marked Adidas training shoes size 9, and we found a receipt to say that he bought them shortly before Samantha Bisset had been murdered. So we knew that he was in possession of those shoes, which put those footprints at the scene. But although that's good evidence, that's not rock solid evidence. So that
surprised me really. Like the fingerprints, it's already proved he's been there. You got the trainer.
Yeah. Well, you see, you're falling into that trap, which a lot of people do. They think, well, we've got that evidence. We'll put that before the court and they'll find him guilty. It doesn't always work out that way. The defence will find ways of having that found inadmissible.
Really?
For instance. So right up until, and he was pleading not guilty. He was charged with the rapes as well, because it came back, his DNA matched the profile for the green chain rapist, which was a big shock to the inquiry team down there.
So now it's slowly building a bigger picture of him, isn't it?
Slowly building it up. So when We had him charged for the rapes and for the murders of Jazmine and Samantha. We had a few months to put the job together. So in part and parcel of that, you look at other things he might have done, because he was obviously a nutter. So, can I say that one?
You're fine.
And he was, he was examined by 3 psychiatrists, and they did find that he was a paranoid schizophrenic, suffering from Asperger's syndrome, and he was. They had to do that examination to see if he was fit to stand trial. The way it is under the McNaughton rules, if you're insane, you can put in a bid not to go on trial.
Oh, really?
Under the McNaughton rules, if you're too insane to know the difference between your actions being right and wrong. But that is put before a jury, not the jury that sit on the murder, a separate jury. So it went before a separate jury, and that took 6 weeks or so. And eventually they found, on a majority decision, that he was fit to stand trial for the murder. He was still pleading not guilty at this stage, and then on the day of the trial, he decided to plead guilty, but to manslaughter, diminished responsibility. He pleaded guilty to the rapes. So he was sentenced then to life imprisonment for a long time, but sent to Broadmoor, which is not a prison. It's a hospital.
Isn't it?
It is a hospital for the criminally insane. So off he went to Broadmoor, and we had a brief window to look around as to what else he might have done. And the thing that really drew our attention was Rachel Nickell. Now, Napper, when he was performing these murders, he kept, you remember the old London A to Z's?
Yeah.
He had a couple of those, and he would fill in his routes where he'd run and jog and walk around on the green chain walk. And in this book, inked in, were various places that include Samantha's house and various other places where these rapes had been committed.
He basically logged it all.
So he logged it, yeah, and thought this is good viewing point, this is good attack point, and that's that sort. Didn't actually say that, but that was obviously what it was for. And they were nearly all in the area of Eltham, Lewisham, down to Woolwich, that sort of southeast London area. Apart from one, well, there were more than one, but one that really stood out, a place called Isabella Plantation, which is in Richmond Park, which is a stone's throw from Wimbledon Common, was heavily borrowed in, and big dot put on it. I thought, well, what's all that about then? And then looking at that and the juxtaposition of that and the Rachel Nickell murder, we went back to the team there. And even though by then Stagg had been vindicated by the judge.
The bit he'd marked his best, he was murdered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They showed us the door, basically. They were still convinced that even though the Judge Ognall had thrown it out and severely criticised the police for their handling of the case, they were still convinced that Stagg did it, and the last thing they wanted was another suspect. So that was, we got that knocked back, and Roger Boydell-Smith, who was the exhibits officer, we decided that we would meet up on a yearly basis, do little bits and pieces around it, make our own inquiries, not as part of a police investigation, just off our own bats, and see how we got on. And we got more and more convinced that that Napper was responsible for this. The press and officially the police were still convinced that Stagg had committed this murder in Wimbledon Common of Rachel Nickell.
Can I just jump into that a little bit? So the Colin Stagg part, that was actually sort of like a bit of a setup, wasn't it? By a sort of, wasn't it a lady pretended like she was wanted to date him or something?
Honey trap, was it?
Yeah, honey trap.
Yeah,
that was it, yeah.
that was, it's mentioned in my book, and it was made into a TV drama called Deceit. And that concentrated on the aspect of they introduced, so convinced were they that Stagg was responsible, and through the psychological profile, they hatched a plot to get an undercover officer to make contact with Stagg to get him to admit to the murder. And really, there's no other way of saying it. They offered sex for him to say that he'd done the killing. That's what it all led up to. But he never ever admitted it. And he said, I'd like to admit to it, but I can't because I didn't do it.
Oh, and he was actually going for it on that.
But they continued. The irony of it was, when they set up the plan, they gave themselves 28 days from the time they introduced the honey trap to the time that he confessed. They limited it to 28 days, and the profiler said that if he hasn't admitted it by then, he never will. But the 28 days came and went, and of course they were so convinced that he had done this for one reason or another. They went ahead and charged him, and then put it together on this DNA psychological profiling, which is, it's Disney World really, and came severely unstuck until roll on now, 2002, I came out of the job, out of homicide, and joined the murder review group. So I thought, oh, happy days. I wonder if Rachel Nickell murder has been reviewed. And it was being reviewed by a team in the office that I was working with. I didn't get to go on the team, but I wandered into the senior investigating officer, and I said, have you thought of Robert Napper? And they didn't have him on the list. And I said, well, give me 10 minutes and I'll write out a quick report why I think he did it. And I brought it back, and yes, I said, all right, put it on the pile. And so they put it on the pile, and I thought, well, it's a step in the right direction. And then we all know how DNA has developed over the years, and from 93 to 2002, it developed a long way. And they resubmitted the clothing of Rachel for further forensic evidence with the idea of looking for DNA. And they found a DNA profile on her clothing. Now that DNA profile, it didn't match Robert Napper. A lot of people think it did. It didn't match Robert Napper, but what it did do was eliminate all of the other 80 suspects that they had. There was over 80 suspects. They all got eliminated against this DNA marker. Yeah. It couldn't say that was Robert Napper, but what it could say that it could be.
Yeah.
So they then did further work, fantastic work, and they refined it and grew it on STR or whatever they did, and they were able to run it through again and came back to Robert Napper, 1 in 4 million or something.
Right.
So he was then arraigned summonsed actually to reappear at the Old Bailey. I went down to the Old Bailey on the day and saw him 13 years later up in number 1, same court, number 1 court at the Old Bailey, and he actually looked across at me and he recognised me as he went down the steps, and he was just sentenced again pleaded to manslaughter and went back to Broadmoor, so his life didn't radically change.
Alan, can I just jump back to obviously when you originally arrested him? You just talk us through that a little bit. So when you first met him and how it came about with the arrest.
Oh, the arrest. Right. Well, we when we identified him through the fingerprints, then we obviously he was living in a flat in Plumstead High Street, a bedsit. and we couldn't, no matter how much surveillance we put on him, we couldn't work out which bedsit he was in. But we had him under surveillance, and he was followed up to London. He went everywhere by public transport. He didn't have a car, he didn't have a driving licence. And he would go up to London and look at knife shops and dirty magazines, that sort of stuff. And then come back, and he wouldn't take direct routes home. He would always go off to a different station and then walk an extra 2 miles, that sort of thing. So they followed him up, and he was obviously behaving a bit oddly. So it was coming up to a bank holiday weekend. It was 6 months after the Samantha Bisset murder, and we start to panic that he was bubbling up to commit another one, or do something. So the decision was made to arrest him, and I had to put together the arrest team. There were 6 of us, I believe, that I put up. Bog standard way of doing these things. I've done hundreds and hundreds of them. The only unusual feature about Napper was one of his previous convictions. He had 2 convictions for firearm offences. So we were a little concerned, because we didn't know exactly which bedsit he was in, that we would run into his flat and he would produce a firearm. So my master plan was to wait for him to come out of the flat. He always clockwork. He worked in a factory down at Thamesmead. He left the house at 7 o'clock every morning. So we had 2 little teams. He always turned right. So I had the team on the right at the junction, left 2 guys back on the left in case he decided this morning to go the other way. And the idea was to arrest him on the street, take him back to the flat, because he'd be unlikely to take a firearm to work with him. That was the plan. So at 7 o'clock, came and went, no Robert Napper. 8 o'clock, and it got on towards 9 o'clock. And thinking, what's gone on? It transpired, cut a long story short, he got the sack the day before. So that's why he hadn't got up to go to work in the morning.
He did have some good luck, didn't he?
Right to the very end. Right to the very end. So then I took a quick decision and marched up to the front door, and it was answered by one of the other tenants. I asked where Bob Napper lived. He pointed to a door. Should we say he leant on the door, and it opened, and there he was, half in, half out of bed, dressed in his underwear, and he was arrested. And but I didn't put the questions to him, because you can't question someone on not on arrest, but you can make a note of anything that they say. And he made this comment. I told him he was under arrest for murder, the 2 murders at Heathfield Terrace, and that's when he said, don't know what you're talking about, I've never been there.
I just denied it, point blank.
Denied it. So in the flat, it was just a 1-room flat, bed on the floor, no bed, back was on the floor, very tidy. There was lots of literature in there about death and how to kill people.
Oh really? What, like he's written, or like
Books,
and...
books, yeah, anything, and he kept lots of odd notebooks where he'd make notes of odd words, all to do with death. I didn't put the questions to him, because you can't question someone on not on arrest, but you can make a note of anything that they say. And he made this comment. I told him he was under arrest for murder, the 2 murders at Heathfield Terrace, and that's when he said, don't know what you're talking about, I've never been there.
I just denied it, point blank.
Denied it. So in the flat, it was just a 1-room flat, bed on the floor, no bed, back was on the floor, very tidy. There was lots of literature in there about death and how to kill people.
Oh really? What, like he's written, or like
Books,
and...
books, yeah, anything, and he kept lots of odd notebooks where he'd make notes of odd words, all to do with death. Then So that was all seized. Also in there was a red metal, the old-fashioned red metal toolbox. Opens both out like a concertina. And in there was a rope, obviously for incapacitating people, some sheath-type daggers that are designed to kill people, basically, that you can get on the internet or wherever. A few things, but nothing to directly incriminate him with any of the rapes or with the murders of Jazmine and Samantha. So he was taken to Bexley Heath, and that's an interesting thing. In the van there was a woman police officer, and she came with me, sat with him in the back of the van down to Bexley Heath, sat with him on the other side of him. We got out of the van into the charge room at Bexley Heath, and when Napper was in front of the charging sergeant, I said to the woman officer, "How tall do you think he is?" And she said, 5'9", 5'10", because he walked with a peculiar stoop, a gait-like stoop, and everyone thought he was much shorter.
Sure. I've seen a couple of photos of him online. He's sort of hunched over, isn't he? So I suppose that gives that sort of appearance.
And all of these victims, rape victims, had underestimated his size, apart from one who, again, oddly, one of the later ones, put him at over 6 foot. But then, when she first reported it to the first officer, but by the time she came down to make a written statement, he turned into 5'9". Now, how that happened, I don't know, Lee, but that's what happened.
So just ask you, what's the you found a tin in the woods?
Yeah, that's there are a couple of other incidents. We started to ferret around about what he'd been up to, and found a report of some children in the woods in Plumstead Common. They'd found a biscuit tin, and kids dug it up. I don't think they found treasure. Opened it up, and there was a .22 firearm in there. So they ran home, told their mum and dad, and they said, "Better tell the police." So the police came down. Police came down, took the firearm away. That was tested against crimes and things that couldn't be matched up. They fingerprinted it, and then it was sort of just forgotten about. But we found this old crime sheet, so we looked at that. We realised that they'd fingerprinted the gun and put the gun through all sorts of tests, but they'd never done anything to the tin. So really? We resubmitted the tin for fingerprints, and on the lid, on the inside of the lid, was a complete handprint of Robert Napper. So that was never ever put to him as a charge. But these were the sorts of things, and there's no doubt that he had hiding places all over the place where, because Samantha, there was a part of her body missing as well.
Oh, really?
So we always felt that we were going to find.
Never got found.
That was a bit of a saga in itself. Right after the first PM, they missed it, but you could see from the shape of the body that it wasn't right. And then another pathologist was brought in, and he quickly realised that he'd cut out a large section of abdominal wall. For whatever reason, we don't know, but I certainly believe that that's probably buried somewhere on his paths. And another thing that he'd done, that we know he'd done, again, it was the crime books in those days. You didn't have these crimes didn't go on computer, so it meant hours and hours of trawling through these things, not just looking for sex offences, but for anything. And there was an entry in there for a criminal damage. And a woman had come home from work and settling down in her flat off Plumstead Common. Suddenly, the window had crashed in, and she didn't know what had happened. She was standing by a light lampshade, and she saw, embedded in the wall, a bullet from a gun. So she called the police, as you probably quite like to, and they took the bullet away. Couldn't find any rhyme nor reason for this ever happening. We matched that, we got hold of that slug because it had disappeared, and it was in the scenes of crime officer's house on his mantelpiece. We eventually tracked it down, matched it to the gun in the tin.
Oh, so
it belonged to that gun. So he had fired that at that woman, just missed her by the stand, probably because of the shadow or something. Missed her, could have killed her there and then.
So he was basically progressing worse and worse. He'd gone from rapes to knives to guns.
Yes, yeah.
So if he hadn't been taken down when he did, he probably would have been.
Well, that brings me on to the other side of this, because we know now that he did murder Rachel Nickell after a long, protracted inquiry. But I thought we put it to bed, but as a result of me bringing out my book, another ex-police officer, Wright, had been doing a lot of work into the Claire Tiltman murder, which happened in January '93 in Greenhithe in Kent. And he was convinced that Robert Napper, could be responsible for this murder. If I just give you a quick run
Because
through
that area there isn't that far, is it, from the rest of his crimes?
It's very close, geographically very close. The Kent police were contacted about the possibility of Napper being involved. They had him as one of their sort of outside suspects, but he was never interviewed over it, and that was never taken very seriously. And it was written off because, we're in Kent and that's in London. But if you look at the actually, Abbey Wood is actually in Kent, although it's in the London borough of Bexley. It's in Kent, and it's 3 train stops down the line, and he went everywhere by train and bus. It would have taken him 20 minutes on the train to get there, to Greenhithe, and the murder was committed within a few hundred yards of the railway station at Greenhithe. So as I say, I didn't take it too seriously at first, but then I started looking into it, and there was more and more to it. I felt that the distinct possibility that Napper could be responsible for the murder of Claire Tiltman. And what we have to bear in mind is that there is someone currently serving life imprisonment for her murder, a guy called Colin Ash Smith, who is currently in Durham prison and has been since his conviction for this murder.
Has he always protested his innocence, though?
Yes.
He has? Okay.
Ash Smith, unfortunately for him, is not a very likeable character, mainly because he has been convicted of 2 very serious assaults on women, which one prior to Claire's murder and one after Claire's murder. It was the one after Claire's murder that really tied things up for the Kent police to put him in the frame for Claire's murder. And he was eventually convicted on bad character evidence because of these attacks on these 2 women quite close to where Claire Tiltman was murdered. But there is no forensic evidence from the scene. There are no witnesses to the murder. And really, bad character evidence is all they've got. And he has appealed and had the appeal turned down. But as I just pointed out, he's always openly admitted the attacks on the previous 2 women. He has always vehemently denied any involvement in Claire Tiltman's murder. And he actually did know her vaguely. And there were various things within that case that perturbed me, that I don't feel right about. And that's why I'm currently working now with Vince to put a job together to present to Kent Police and about this being a possible miscarriage of justice.
Yeah, because if that isn't him, even though he's a bad character, he's done something else, doesn't really should take the punishment for
No.
someone else, does it?
No. And the temptation is, of course, he's committed these horrible offences. Why are we worried about him?
Yeah.
But I'm afraid I can't subscribe to that point of view. Especially as I feel, if he didn't do it, who did? And that could quite possibly be Robert Napper. He had easy access to it. Rachel was killed in July 92. Claire was killed January 93. Samantha Bisset was killed in November 93. So it's slap bang in the middle. At that date of Claire Tiltman's murder, he was unemployed and he was in receipt of quite a substantial amount of redundancy money. Not a huge amount, but a couple of £1,000. So he was happily moving about without having to work, and we know that he was all over the place. At the beginning of the inquiry, well, obviously they didn't consider Napper because Napper hadn't been arrested when Claire was murdered, but he was considered later, and they looked into it. And one of the reasons I've seen that they dismissed him from the inquiry because they said he was in prison at Christmas. He was in prison for a shoplifting offence, but he'd been released early for Christmas and come out on Boxing Day. But like so many of these, I've had these cases in the past where people say they're in prison because they got 6 months away.
Yeah.
But when you look into it,
Released early.
yeah, they come out, they're out. He was out and about. And it was the 18th of January when she was killed, nearly 3 weeks after he was released from prison.
Obviously, the Robert Napper killings are quite horrific, aren't they? With the knife sort of stabbings. The guy that got convicted, had he had sort of knife offences or?
Yes, he
So
had attacked the other two women using a knife, but
actually
nowhere
murdered.
near. One of them could have died.
Right.
Let's be frank about it. But you still, when you compare the offences of Rachel, Samantha, and Claire, they match in ferocity and application, whereas Colin Ash Smith's previous two offences don't really. I mean, you could argue that he was practising and he was getting better at it, but well, he wouldn't, because Claire was in the middle of his 3 offences. But so I have my concerns about it, and I'm retired now, but I have no other interest in it other than an interest, and these things do plague me.
So Alan, can I just ask you a little bit of the sort of thought process of these killers, sort of how they think or how they go about their ways, and what's your thought process on this?
Well, it's I mean, I interviewed him after the offence, and he was very difficult to relate to. Now, he already had psychological disorders and had been an outpatient at various mental hospitals since he was a child. His mental state had obviously deteriorated, and as I said earlier, he had been examined by 3 or 4 psychiatrists to assess his mental state. But talking to him in interview was quite a bizarre experience. He couldn't concentrate on the issue in hand. He would veer off into odd patterns of speech, and he had a sort of stockpile of quite long words that he would introduce into the conversation, but didn't really. They weren't the correct word to apply in those circumstances. He just had these odd words, and he would be very subservient almost. He would say, "Thank you very much" all the time. And the other thing about it is, if you got anywhere near asking him questions about the offence, he'd clam up immediately, turn to his solicitor and say, I don't want to go on anymore now, and they would call a stop, and it must have been stopped 5 or 6 times in this way. As soon as we started to get him to open up, he would suddenly close down, turn to his solicitor and ask for an adjournment. He was very calm and quiet when he was in the cell. He didn't rant and rave. As far as I understand it, he's a model prisoner.
Oh, really?
He doesn't mix with anyone. He's not the sort of person who would ever have had any real friends, certainly not girlfriends. And all of the reports we got back from places where he'd worked, the women were frightened of him.
Oh, really?
She, especially if they were in a position of authority above him, he couldn't handle that.
As in the way he was with them, or just his sort of...
Oh, he would be, he'd be aggressive. Not physically aggressive, but in his speech, he would try and demean them. Just generally be an obnoxious character.
So that was only towards women as such, not...
Mainly towards women. He in his digs where he lived, he was convinced that he was being spied on all the time, that people were introducing poisons into his food. And this was all progressing down the line at the same time that his activity in the rape field were getting progressively more violent. And then we know
like
he
a
killed...
paranoia.
Yes,
In, like...
that was almost out of control. Well, he held a job down, managed to hold this job down in the factory. It was pretty menial work, but he held it down until he had got the sack, because people just couldn't cope with him anymore. He wouldn't do what he was told. He would be argumentative about everything. And that was how he was.
How was he with the police and yourself?
Subservient. That's the word I would use.
Just no aggressive to him or not?
No, absolutely none. Absolutely none. He was like a wet fish. Characterless.
Quite strange, really, when you think of someone actually who can murder someone and go to the extreme, then to not be able to challenge.
Well, as I understand it, it's there are sides to his psyche. That one minute he's this Robert Napper, and then he's that Robert Napper.
Right.
And even during the killing of Samantha, the one offence where he had the luxury of time on his hands, one of the witnesses from the flat above described how she heard two men shouting at each other. And one of them was shouting, "That's enough, leave it, leave it." Now, we believe that was him shouting himself.
Oh, really? Blimey.
Because there was no one else there, that's for absolute sure.
Just having a conversation with yourself.
Yeah.
Where was that? Where was...
In the flat, in Samantha Bisset's
That
flat,
was Samantha Bisset's
shouting
flat.
out, yeah.
Blimey. So he was battling with himself on a daily
Battling with
basis, pretty
himself,
much.
yeah. So there was still something there that he knew it was wrong.
Yeah.
But
A bit like an angel and a devil on each shoulder, just
and
directing him.
reading his writings, he believed, for instance, that the IRA were after him, that he'd won the Nobel Peace Prize in Angola, and he had this thing about calendars, that the government had taken several years out of the calendar to do him out of some award or other, so he was always behind times. And this was the government's fault. He knew he was on personal terms with the Queen. She knew what he was up to, and she agreed with everything that he did.
So it really was not quite a fool to get.
Yeah, I mean, I had forgotten those aspects, but there were. I mean, this guy. Many members of the public think, you're caught now. You're gonna pull the old madness card, but I think in Robert Napper's case,
He was gone.
he was irredeemably.
Well, could you just tell us a little bit about Robert Napper's sort of family?
He was born in Abbey Wood. I think it was, he had two other siblings. Very violent father who caused a lot of problems in the household. Left when he was about 7. Even in his primary school, he was always a problem child. Kept himself very much to himself. Nobody could ever get to Robert Napper. He went on a holiday, a family holiday. Someone befriended the family, classic stuff. Befriended the family, took them camping, and sexually assaulted the children, including Napper. Now the other children, obviously, they had a deeply unhappy childhood, but they all seemed to have overcome it. They were all received treatment for what they'd suffered, but Robert had never ever got over it.
Yeah, still carried that with him.
He carried that with him, and funny enough, when after he was arrested, one of the things, obviously, you've got to notify everybody, and I had to find out whether his father was still alive. So eventually, through the Australian police, found him, dug him out down in New South Wales somewhere, and arranged to speak to him on a telephone call, and got through at the arranged time, and introduced myself and got him to introduce himself and tell me a bit about Robert Napper, which he couldn't very much. I just wanted to verify that it was his son. He did enough to do that. So then I told him I had some very bad news, that his son had been arrested for rape and murder. And there was a silence on the phone, and then this strong Australian voice bellowed down the phone, "I blame his mother." So beg your pardon, I blame his mother, it's all her fault. I said, well, you've obviously had a shock. I said, look, I'll phone you the same time tomorrow, and you can have a think about it, and if there's anything you want to ask me. I phoned him back on the arranged time, never answered, I never heard from him again.
Just wanted to wash his hands of it completely. Yeah. Alan, can I just ask you about your own mindset of sort of building up to the arrest and your thought process? You know, did this sort of case make you sort of not sleep at night or stuff like that?
Well, this obviously once we found out who our quarry was, Robert Napper, we were all hugely excited, and then Pam Robinson, our indexer, shouted out, "I know who that is. That's the Green Chain Rapist." And my first reaction was I knew that the photo fit was, we ran a little porter cabin office down in Thamesmead at the time. That's where we ran the inquiry from, and there was a photo fit of him on the notice board in the public part of the police station. So I ran out there, jumped over the counter, past the uniform officer who was standing there, ripped it off, ran back into the office, and we compared it to the photograph of Napper, and we just knew that was. So we were getting more and more excited about this, and then Detective Superintendent Banks and DI Brian Reeves, who was the deputy, sort of got everyone to steady up. First of all, we wanted to keep it in house, that we didn't want everyone knowing that we had the suspect for this job. So it was all kept very much under wraps, but we were very, very excited that we'd eventually put this job to bed. For me personally, because it did give me sleepless nights. I had seen what he had done. We went 6 months without knowing who was responsible for that. Now, it won't take a genius to work out, looking at that scene, that wasn't a one-off. That was going to happen again somewhere. And it was imperative that we caught this bloke. We had to catch him. We had to move heaven and earth to get that bloke, because sure as eggs were eggs, he was going to do it again. So when we eventually did find Robert Napper, and then these other things, because all of this background stuff about the tin in the woods, the shot through the window, that all came to light while he was still in his bedsit down in the High Street. And then we started to build up, put him under surveillance. I wasn't on the surveillance team, that's a specialist job, but I was in an observation point, watching him going in and out of his flat. Yeah, there were long hours, but used to that. And then we knew we were building up, because we'd been told that we weren't going to give him any chance to commit another offence. You just can't imagine it, what would have happened if he'd have gone out once we'd identified him and committed some horrendous offence.
Is that something that would play on your mind? Like if you know it is and he's gone out and done it again, would just make you feel like...
You obviously you think about it, but you've got to you've got to, just step back. What have we got here? What more can we get before we nick him, to make sure that when we do arrest him, we've got everything there and we're not faffing about.
So he's not back out on the streets.
Yeah. So we had him under surveillance for a week, and eventually, 2 days before, Mickey Banks called us all in, and he said that he was going to bring the team, get a larger team. We already had the surveillance officers come in, but that he got other people in, and we had a body dog in case there were any body parts in the flat, because it's a system that works. So we had this massive meeting with all of these people, our team, our little 5-man team, sitting in the CID office at Plumstead, that had suddenly grown to about 60 people sitting around this massive desk. Mickey Banks tells us what's going to happen, tells everybody who everybody is, explains what time we're going to all meet in the morning and we're going to nick him, and where he's going to be put, and everything's worked out in advance. And my part was to put a little team together, go to the address and arrest him on the street, which didn't happen, as I've already explained. So, came to my part, went all the way around the table, everyone saying what they were going to do, what they had to do. Came to my part, I went through my little scenario of we, merry little crew of 6, would go down there and cover the street, and when he came out, we pounce on him, take him in, that's it, nick him, take him to Bexley. And then I looked to my left for the next guy to do his little party piece. And the voice suddenly appears next to the senior investigating officer. I don't agree with any of that. And I was put firmly in my place that my arrest team tactics were woefully inadequate. We needed double cordons, we needed dogs, we needed backup from territorial support, we needed that. What we didn't need, I couldn't imagine. So I was a little bit taken aback. And then Mickey Banks looked down the table at me with his gimlet eye and said, "Alan, are you happy with the plan you have in place?" And I thought, well, this is it. And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Right, we'll go with that then. But if it all goes wrong, it's down to you." So that night I went, the meeting finished, and that did put me out of my stride a bit.
Yeah.
Because then I'm thinking...
You got that added pressure.
Yes, I'm thinking, well, I thought it was all right, but what if it does all go wrong? But I thought, no, just stick with it. And I had a sleepless night. And coming into Plumstead in the morning to do the arrest, we had to be in about some god-awful hour, about 5:30 or 6 o'clock, something like that. So I got up even earlier and I drove down to Samantha's flat, and I just sat there for a couple of minutes, and just through my own mind I thought, well, Samantha, Jazmine said, we're hopefully today we're going to catch it all up and at least get some sort of justice for you. And then I drove down down to Plumstead and picked up the team and gave them a final briefing, and I've been through how it all went wrong, but came right in the end, as these things do. Just got to think on your feet.
So the other guy really wanted everything all singing, all dancing.
Oh, yeah.
Wouldn't that sort of alarm him a little bit more though, like if there's a noise activity?
Yeah.
So the way you was going to do it, he's sort of out of the blue, isn't it?
It's a bloke getting nicked.
Yeah.
It may be a big job, but it's a bloke getting nicked.
If you hear a load of dogs barking helicopters, you're going to be
Yes.
more likely to be alert.
Exactly.
Especially if he's got firearms offences.
Yeah.
So,
None of us were armed, by the way.
so
Or even had body vests on.
Alan, can I ask you a little bit? So you've wrote a book about this, haven't you?
Yes.
Which is, where is it? We've got it somewhere. This is the book there.
Hold it up, Lee. A little bit higher. That's it.
So this is Alan's personal story of the. Sorry, got it? So can you just tell us a little bit through that, Alan? That's your personal story there.
This book, there's a lot more in here than I've been able to squash into this interview.
Yeah.
But after the Nickell revelations, I thought to myself, I've got a story to tell here about my part as a junior officer investigating a very, very serious, high-profile offence, which fell to me by accident. It would normally be the role that I was taking would have normally been performed by a much more senior officer than I was. And I thought it involved so many aspects that affect the police, the public, that I wanted to write it down. There's the side of it where, why does the media go into raptures over a murder like Rachel Nickell and doorstep families all over the country and pour resources into it and bribe people to tell their stories, whereas Samantha reaches page 2 of the news shopper for 1 week and then that's the end of it. Whereas in fact it was just as, if not more horrendous than the Nickell murder. So I wanted to examine that, the media's role in what happens in the investigation of serious offences. Then there was the psychological profiling aspect of it, how we'd gone down this path of relying too much on psychiatrists' opinions or profilers' opinions. They are there as tools for us to use, not for us to be led by.
Yeah.
And these 3 cases absolutely exemplify how the traps that you can fall into if you put too much reliance on psychological profiling. So there was that, and then there was the mere fact of the grind of one of these sorts of investigations, and a little bit about the people that are down there in the coal mine, digging away, whose main worry was that maybe next week, next month, they're going to get shut down.
Yeah.
All the while knowing that Mr. Robert Napper was going to do it again. So I thought I'd put these down in a book form, and it came fairly easy to me. Rattled it off, and the idea behind it being that if anything else, when I'm long gone, my kids or my grandchildren might pick it up and think, well, that's what the old man did. No one, yeah, that was the reasoning behind it.
Yeah.
And then I mentioned it to, I was doing a documentary on a murder. I mentioned it to the director, and he asked to have a look at it, passed it on to a publisher, who took it up, published it, and then it was made into a film on a series on Channel 4. And I'm now hoping, or in the process of writing another book, which will be on the possibility, the good possibility, of Napper being involved in the murder of Claire Tiltman.
Which it looks like he was by Vincent Wright's interview we done.
Yes, well, I refer all your viewers back to Vincent Wright's interview on this, because he's done a sterling bit of work around that Claire Tiltman murder. All unpaid. No other incentive other than just justice be done.
Yeah, get justice. Well, if people want to read the book, Alan, where can they find that on?
Well, it's on Amazon.
Amazon.
And you can get it through Waterstones as well. So
Can you just hold it up to the camera there, Alan? Hold it up a little bit higher so the viewers can see it. A little bit higher. That's it.
yes, on Amazon and in Waterstones, you can order it through them. Or the publisher. Hang on, let me see what. Oh yeah. Oh, and of course the publisher, Waterside Press, which specialise in crime books. That's it.
Lovely. Wind it up. We wind it up there, Alan. Thanks for coming. Much appreciated. Thanks for today.
Well, nice meeting you, and
Look forward to the new book.